Stephen Asma, as I live and breathe.
It is I.
Live and breathe. It is you. What a
How are you doing, my friend?
Really good. Really good. Top drawer. I think I'm pitching at the top of my game these days, Steve. Absolutely.
Are you the master of like 19th century slang? Is that
diction? Is that top drawer, top shelf? Is that like an old school?
Whoa, he shot his bolt.
Oh, shot his bolt. What is that? He shot his bolt. Is that like a crossbow thing?
Yeah, it's like he basically
Whoops,
he's all done.
He's sort of like
he's done his best. He's done.
So he just okay. So shot his bolt, and that goes back to like what, like the Middle Ages. We got guys like
I don't know. Like I think of it as like a 19th century thing, but it might be.
I wonder if it's like Shakespeare or something. I wonder if like Shakespeare came up with that, because he came up with a lot of stuff like that. Apparently, he like invented a lot of things.
Sounds vaguely obscene.
It also sounds vaguely obscene. It also sounds vaguely kind of like, well, oh dear, he's all out of juice, that guy. Which I guess is more.
Anywho, back to Shakespeare.
Back to Shakespeare. Well, Shakespeare had plenty of that stuff. Had all that. That's funny. The whole like thing with Shakespeare with the like, all the God. I can't. This is where you lose me with Shakespeare. When you have to do like the Shakespeare clowns who are all making the jokes that don't mean nothing anymore. Where it's all just like, it's, the tailor stuck his needle in the sock for, and you're like, oh, brother, really?
It doesn't age well, that stuff.
No, it doesn't age well. It's really bad. And if you get stuck playing one of those parts, you have to be like walking around just being like, the butcher of Eastcheap is suffering the wind from the north. You're like,
is there a director
that's not funny.
Like, do they cut it out? Like let's just edit that shit. Or some people are like purists.
Well, some people are purists, and some people are purists. Some people edit it out. Some people actually can make that shit funny. and I think a lot of the time, because they sort of make fun of how it's not funny, maybe. I don't know. But it's like,
now you have done Hamlet, right? What other Shakespeare
I have
you done?
Steve.
Yes.
I haven't done that much Shakespeare. No, I've not done that much Shakespeare. I did Hamlet, and I did
who would you like to play, like in a Shakespeare play?
In a Shakespeare play?
Yeah, like a Falstaff kind of guy.
Yeah, I played Falstaff once a long time ago, and but it was not what I would call a professional production. But it was good. I almost played Iago once. Iago's a good part, Othello, Iago. There's one that nobody ever does called Timon of Athens, which is good.
Oh, I've heard of it, but
he's like this guy who's betrayed by all of his friends, and he goes and lives in a cave, becomes a hermit. It's a weird play. Nobody ever does.
There's a lot of plays like that just never cut through. They're not the blockbusters.
The Shakespeare blockbusters. Yeah, no, there's definitely, he wrote a bunch of. It's true.
The summer theater don't take them on.
No, you can't, because it's just like, whoa, boy, it's already, I don't know.
Timon of Athens.
Shakespeare's a whole Timon of Athens. Shakespeare's a whole other thing. I mean, we should do a thing sometime about Shakespeare.
We should do a show on Shakespeare.
Absolutely. The whole whether he wrote Shakespeare and stuff, because I think
awesome.
that whether he's the guy who wrote it or not, that would be good. Well, here we are already, like chin-wagging away, aren't we, Steve?
We are. We're already doing it.
We're already
doing it. That's what the fans love. That's what the listeners dig. And
let's hope so.
They should, pay us back a little bit by heading over to Apple.
Nice.
And Spotify and all the other platforms.
Rate us, do that stuff.
Us,
but you know what? They should go one better, Steve. They should run through the Rolodex in their head of all of their weird friends, and they should just get right to those people. Just text them right now. Just text them a link to this. You know what I mean? Text them a link to this, the Chinwag podcast. Just, get in touch with your friends. Your weird friends, your weird-ass friends, and hook them into the show.
Listen to Paul's voice, and like a Manchurian candidate, reach for your phone and just fucking send something to your friends.
Wow. Oh, my God. Scary thought.
Help us out here.
But seriously, and you people have been great with the ratings. And
we do get a lot of great
reviews
feedback
and stuff like that. It's really nice. All right, Steve. Moving on to the business at hand, we have a deep dish chinwag today. Let me tell you.
Deep thinker, profound thinker.
If you listen to us a lot, we like to delve into matters of consciousness, right? Awareness, being, states of being and stuff. Our guest today explores the mysteries of those subjects from all angles, even from the very depths of the ocean, Steve.
Nice.
Our special guest is Professor in the School of History and Philosophy of Science at the University of Sydney. He's a very accomplished scuba diver and the author of many books, including Metazoa and the bestseller Other Minds, The Octopus, the Sea, and the Deep Origins of Consciousness.
He is not, he sort of puts the lie to the stereotypes about philosophers, because this guy actually gets in the ocean, swims with the octopus, and tries to understand their minds. It's pretty cool.
No, it's what I think is really cool about him. So we're really pleased to have him joining us on the Chinwag. Welcome, Professor Peter Godfrey-Smith. Hello, sir.
Hi, nice to meet you all.
Very nice to meet you. It's a real pleasure. Thank you so much for doing this. I am the layman here, and so I might just let Steve ease us into a conversation about consciousness and mind, and we'll see where it goes from there. But I'm the layman. I'm going to listen a little bit and begin to chip in as we go along. Anyway, Steve.
Well, I thought it would be fun to start with just the octopus. Could you just give us like a thumbnail sketch of the sort of the life ways of the octopus? Like, I was surprised by the things I learned, like about the lifespan and, you know, are they good parents? Are they bad parents? Like, give us a little sketch of what the octopus life is like.
Their life is very unexpected given the complexity of their behavior and the size of the nervous system. They don't have the kind of life that you expect to find in an intelligent, big-brained animal. Very short-lived. They rush through their lives. They're, in almost every case, dead within 2 years of coming to exist, a very short lifespan, often dead within a year. They're not very social. People think that sociality is very important in the evolution of, complex brains and complex behavior, but most octopuses are not very social at all. They have this weird brain architecture where most of the neurons are not where you'd expect to find them in the central brain, but spread through the body, which raises all sorts of questions about what kind of self they have, whether the self is kind of radically decentered in comparison with ourselves. So that's just a start.
Like it's in the arms?
The upper arms, there's a lot of neurons in this sort of network in the upper arms.
Do they have anything close to a sort of central brain? Or is it really just, they do have something that's a kind of central brain?
Yeah, I mean, the central brain, if we just think of the central brain and set aside the fact that most of the neurons are outside of it, it's still a pretty big central brain. It's still several 100 million neurons, which is a good-sized brain. The totality is about 500 million neurons in the whole body, less than half in the central brain, but still that's a lot. Several 100 million. It's a pretty weird organization. There's sort of two main parts to it. There's the sort of really central bit, which is sometimes called the central brain. I'm holding up my hands. It's shaped a bit like a sort of a donut where the esophagus runs through the middle. So you don't want to get food stuck in your throat if you're an octopus.
Which is a strange, and is there any evolutionary use for that? Or is it just, that's so odd? Why would that have developed that way? Is there any reason for that?
I think it probably is that way because, they're mollusks. They're built on a kind of architecture that's shared among not all mollusks, but a bunch of mollusk relatives. And most mollusks, the brain is not a very big deal. It's a pretty small brain. So yeah, why not have it donut-shaped around your esophagus? It's only when you make it really, really big like an octopus, it's like, what have I done? How did I end up with this ridiculous-shaped brain? And you also have behind the eyes two big things called the optic lobes, which have a ton of neurons. And those are sometimes seen as sort of outside of the central brain. So there's the central center, the really central brain, which has this weird esophagus shape and has the smartest, it's thought, part of the brain in there. Then you have these big processes behind the eyes, and then you have lots and lots of neurons spread through the body.
Are you, one of the things that's really cool is you're actually diving with these things, and you go to this like area where many of them live, Octopus, I think you were calling it. And you said that, because you mentioned the eyes, you said they look at you like they're regarding you, like there's somebody home, or you get the sense that they're taking you in. Is that right?
Yeah. That's right, and it's not just at Octopus. That's a general feature of octopuses that I think is important, even though it has a kind of impressionistic feel to it. You know, you get a strong sense that you're being inspected, and that the animal, in at least some cases, is interested in you. I mean, often they're not interested in you, but they may be interested in you. And that can seem impressionistic, but I think it's significant because it shows there's a kind of inquisitive engagement with the world that an octopus can sort of turn on. It can focus attention on you as an object of interest. And attention of that kind, selective attention, inquisitive, focused attention, not just in my picture, but in some other views about the neuroscience of consciousness, is regarded as a significant kind of trait. So that focus that you can see in the animal, which is overt, is itself, I think, quite telling about what's going on inside.
Curiosity, in the sense, a kind of like curiosity about the environment around itself. Can you do something for me? Oh no, please, go ahead.
I think curiosity is an important feature. You see it in giant cuttlefish and some other cuttlefish, their relatives as well. I don't know if it's really there in squid. I haven't seen or read about that, but it's an important part of their engagement with the world, an interest in novel objects in the case of an octopus. There's, for example, I'll go through this anecdote. The site that you mentioned, Octopus, is it's a sort of shell bed. It's very quiet at the moment, unfortunately. We might talk about this at some stage. It's not how it should be at the moment, unfortunately.
It's not flourishing.
But it's a shell bed, and the picture we have is that the octopuses have created the shell bed because they bring in scallops to eat and they leave the shells, and that provides a building material for other octopuses who bring in more scallops to eat, and that a kind of positive feedback process. So I got curious about the whether it was growing or shrinking, the shell bed. So I thought, well, I'll make some markers. I made these plastic stakes with a weight that was taped in, quite heavy. I got a big heavy bolt and a plastic garden stake, and I put these at the north, south, east, west edges of the shell bed and thought, well, I'll come back in the future and see if the shell bed is contracted or expanded in relation to these things. And the very next time I came down there, an octopus had pulled out one of these stakes and brought it back to the central den and was kind of holding it there. Now, initially, it's quite possible that this octopus might have thought this was edible, a really weird shell that might be broken into.
Right.
But it would have become pretty clear quickly that was not going to work. And literally years later, that stake was still being retained by octopuses.
By generations of octopuses coming down. Oh my God, how weird. That's amazing.
Do they pick it up and like fondle it and shit? Like, are they, you know what I mean? Are they playing with it?
I haven't seen them actively doing that, but they've brought it back to the shell bed. It's not always there. Sometimes we've gone back and it's not. So I don't know if I don't think they're storing it somewhere.
They're hoarding the steak.
How fascinating. Well, you know what? It's interesting because that sounds like crows, ravens, magpies. It sounds like these birds that do that kind of thing. Whereas they seem to be using it often for some utilitarian thing. Aren't they using it in their nests and things like that? It's more directed than this sounds like it is, which this sounds more sophisticated, actually, because we don't know why the hell they're doing it. And maybe it's aesthetic or something. Is there any possibility of that? I
would say so, using the term broadly. I mean, playfulness, there's a kind of playful aesthetic nature to it, perhaps. It's like, this is, if you're an animal that is interested in new sources of food, that's going to spill over into just interest in novelty. And that might persist even when you've worked out this thing is not food. It's still, this is this interesting thing. It's different from everything else that's down here. I'm going to hang on to it at my den and don't try and take it from me.
One thing I was thinking about was, because you talked about play in the book, and I was noticing, because I was looking, is it social play? And I know that mammals all most of them engage in a kind of rough and tumble play that's very social. But my theory about here, I'm going to get the cat lovers pissed at me. But when I see cats play, they seem to be playing like with the tinfoil ball or with the object, whereas it seems like the dog is playing with you. You know, you throw the stick, it comes back. It feels like the dog is playing with you, whereas the cat seems like it's just got a curiosity about the object. Any meaning, any sense to that, or am I just anti-cat? What if?
Well, in the
Oh,
cat
boy.
case, I mean, we have a cat, and it does a lot of play ambushes.
Yeah. I was going to say, they will attack you, which
with, like,
seems very
play
directed.
attack.
Yeah.
In a way that's very kind of, I mean, there's the big rush of the ambush and then a little tap as the culmination.
That's right.
And that seems like social play, analogous to the dog case to me. So I strike back on behalf of the
Okay.
I do
cat-
too, actually. I'm a cat
lovers.
lover. Yeah, I'm a cat lover too. Can you do one thing for me before we proceed? And this is the thing that I got a little bit, I wasn't confused, but I want to just have you help me by sort of defining them, is the difference between consciousness and sentience seems like a very key thing that I don't know that I was making the nuanced distinction between them when I started reading your books and listening to your talks. Could you just make that distinction for me, please?
The terminology is a total mess, and there's not a consensus about how to make the distinction, if there is a distinction. I mean, when I was a student decades ago, the word consciousness was used for something, very sophisticated, involving sort of self-awareness, perhaps, or something over and above just the mere presence of feeling of any kind at all. But from the end of the last century onwards, and I'm sure Stephen will weigh in about whether this semantic change this change in the language is vivid to him as well, but it seemed to me that the language just began to mutate in both philosophy and in neuroscience and in psychology. All the people who beginning to think more about this, there was just a tendency to use the word consciousness much more broadly. So if there's any feeling there at all in an animal or some other system, like a computer, if it feels like anything to be that system, then that counts as a conscious system. Consciousness is just that, the presence of feeling. Now, when I began writing about this, including the octopus stuff, I wanted to resist this sort of terminological change because I think it's useful to go back to an earlier way of talking where consciousness was reserved for something over and above just the presence of feeling. But I've given up on that because it's just impossible. Everybody is talking the other way.
Okay.
So if you go to a neuroscience conference now and talk as if there's a clear distinction between consciousness and sentience, a lot of people will think you just don't understand. I mean, they're sort of the same thing in the language that's often now spoken. Now, if you want to resist that and go back to the earlier or an earlier way of talking, I think in some ways would be a good thing. But the language has just gone down this road where consciousness is the presence of the fact that it feels like something to be you makes you conscious, and that's kind of it.
And that's sentience as well. Okay, so it's a sense.
Yeah, the word sentience is sometimes reserved for the side of experience or felt experience that features pleasure and pain, good and bad.
Okay,
and that can be helpful because that's a really important category. But there's a big project based in the UK at the moment called the called the Foundations of Sentience project that Jonathan Birch and other people are running, which has produced a lot of important work. And in all that work, they use the word sentience in a way that is not intended to imply pleasure and pain. Any kind of experience counts. It's really the foundations of experience. So felt experience, sentience, consciousness. People use the terms with emphasis that might be, helpful to them in a context, but there's not a kind of definite distinction between any of these anymore.
Yeah, I like the way you were talking in the book about it's sort of more helpful to think about like layers or levels of consciousness, and the idea that an octopus or like a cephalopod could be having a kind of a set of pains or pleasures that might be more like a white noise in the background, and then maybe not so consolidated, like this is my arm that's now hurt. Like we would, if I hit my hand in the door, I'm going to be like,
Huh.
my arm hurts. Some animals might be just feeling a kind of random distributed pain
Huh.
without like owning it in the same way that you and I would. And then you looked at, does the animal tend to its wounds as some kind of evidence that it's actually having pain sort of
Huh.
like us? That was really interesting. And you found in octopuses that they sort of do or they don't tend to their wounds.
Well, when I wrote the octopus book, it was very unclear, but a paper came out in 2021 that made it much clearer. Robin Crook in San Francisco wrote a paper that I think is the best paper on octopus pain, where she made an argument that octopuses do feel acute pain, pain from an event, possibly in a way that's not too dissimilar to us, based on a bunch of different converging lines of evidence that all point in this way. And one of them was really definite grooming of an injured site. So that's all firmed up quite a lot since the book Other Minds. I think it's now, quite likely that octopuses feel pain, or more than quite likely.
I mean, in the tradition, there's this, some of our listeners might want to just get this kind of quick sketch, which is the tradition, going back to Descartes, was Descartes thought that animals look like they're in pain and they do things that are similar to our behaviors, but really Descartes thought there was nobody home. Animals were just machines. They might scream out, but it's not our kind of pain. And so philosophers sort of followed that lead for a long time. I think the average person recognizes that animals feel pain, but the opposite problem is the anthropomorphism, which is, are we projecting human things onto our animals in a way that's illegitimate?
That always seems like
weave between the two.
Yeah, that always seems problematic to me with this stuff, because it feels almost impossible to not be doing that, to be projecting how we would respond to things onto these animals, when seems to me like conscious, sentient, it's going to be an alien consciousness that I can't really conceive of, really, I would think.
And if one looks at, a cat and then an octopus and just comes to feel confident about one's intuitive reaction to how they behave, then you've got to think about earthworms and leeches and simpler ones that have similar kind of anthropomorphizable flinching responses to things that happen. It's
maddening.
It's a big, maddening in a good way. It's a big, difficult, interesting problem.
Yeah. But what this brings so I mean, it's to broadly talk about what you're talking about. You sort of talk about kind of the history of animal life is kind of the history of action and movement and motion. And that this is sort of leading to the development of consciousness, I suppose. I'm speaking really crudely and broadly. And so that the more complex your movements are getting, the more your brain is developing. That's the idea. So, and in the water, you have these, is it arthropods, the crabs and things like that, shrimp and stuff like that. And they're sort of developing more of this. But then you have things like trees and plants that aren't moving. They don't have a nervous system. Can we say something like that is sentient? Can we say something like that is, obviously we don't know, but I can remember sort of in the 70s, there was all this sort of, what was that crazy, the Emotional Life of Plants book, the private life of plants or whatever it was. Big thing all about how plants scream and they feel pain and all these things. And that all sounded very pseudoscientific and crazy, but we don't think in the same way of a tree having consciousness the way we do as an octopus because of its sedentary nature.
Some people take plant sentience really seriously now. And I have to admit that there are some findings that, I think, oh, that's surprising.
Really?
There's some stuff. Yeah.
Oh, don't do this to me, man. Don't do
this
to me.
No, this is great.
I talk a bit about this in the second book, Metazoa. So it has a discussion of plants. And I come down on the, I think, no sentience in plants, no felt experience in plants. I come down on that side. I think nervous systems are really very special.
Uh-huh.
But there are things that, could keep a person up at night on this. There's a study, I've forgotten the name of the first author, but they sort of injured a particular part of the plant, I think just with chomping it or simulating someone chomping it. And there was a signaling cascade initiated that went sort of quite far, not quickly because it's a plant, it takes longer than it would in an animal, but the signaling cascade went through the organism and was used to prepare an adaptive response to possible danger, possible damage. And the way it was done was using chemicals that are not that far off the way it would be done in an animal. It was quite an animal-like response to damage. So you look at that and I was surprised by that. I thought, okay, that's... And then one steps back and thinks, okay, I mean, it's a signaling process. And signaling, if it's a communicative sort of matter where you've got one part of the plant that senses something happening and there's some point to it getting information to other parts of the plant via a signaling pathway, that's not itself a kind of sentience involving. I mean, communication is smart in a way, but it's not a kind of smartness that immediately implies felt experience. So we might find ourselves deciding that, okay, plants are smarter than it looked. They have there's more that's cognitive, more information processing going on there. But we might simultaneously say, and the way it's done is just a way that doesn't have an experiential side to it. So I think that's one way things might go.
There's a funny story that you may know this, Peter, but Daniel Dennett, this philosopher, tells the story about a sea squirt barnacle. In the first half of its life, it's essentially looking for a place to root itself, and it's like a filter feeder. So once it finds this place and it roots itself, now its life is going to be like a plant. So it has these tentacles or whatever, and it no longer needs to find any place. It doesn't need locomotion. It doesn't need its brain, and so it eats its own brain. It just absorbs its own brain as a kind of protein. Yeah, you could correct this story. But that's,
is this dubious? Is this...
Well, yeah. Well, this story was, I've forgotten who first said that. It was a biologist, a fairly important biologist, and it got picked up by philosophers, including Dennett and Pat Churchland and a few other people, and it became this lovely piece of lore with an O, with analogies to tenure and that kind of thing.
I see, right. Okay.
And then I came across an article by people who actually work on sea squirts, actual sea squirt biologists. I've forgotten the guy's name. And they were quite indignant about this story.
Set the record straight.
Wrote an article about nervous systems in sea squirts and said, look, this is completely inaccurate. In fact, the animal has a perfectly good brain, or perfectly good, actually, I think you said brain, not just nervous system. A sea squirt, once it's settled down, has a perfectly good brain, just as well suited to the life that it will lead, after as the brain. So it does transform its body and its brain. But the idea that it ends up brainless, these biologists thought was really an outrageous slur on sea squirts. On sea squirts.
Yeah, but the general lesson is one that I like, which is to ask, why does the organism need intelligence or consciousness? And a lot of them won't need it. So why would it evolve is sort of the interesting question.
I mean, it's from my basic sort of layman's pessimistic view of the world too. Like, and this is certainly a big, but is it needed? Is it necessary? Is it useful? I mean, for us, I'm thinking of mostly, I see how it's useful for an octopus, actually, more than it's useful for us in some ways, consciousness, because it seems to me to just lead us into horrible trouble. So I'm always wondering, what's the purpose to it in some ways as an evolutionary? Is it just a weird side effect of things? Is it a byproduct of motion and stuff? It's anyway. I leave it to you.
That's a really hard question.
Yeah,
And
yes.
there's even by this by the
I'm sorry.
standards of this conversation, that's a really hard question.
Yes.
And all I can do is sort of chip away a little tiny bit. But let me just say a couple of things.
Please.
There's a way of talking about consciousness that I think is probably unhelpful or misleading, where you think you've got this highly capable animal which is moving around, which is sensing, which is learning, which is remembering, and you imagine consciousness being like an app that might be kind of stuck on or not stuck on as an extra thing.
Uh-huh.
Actually, I think that there's a guy called Michael Trestman who wrote a short thing ages ago when she asked, is consciousness more like an operating system or more like an app?
Uh-huh.
And that's quite a good way of asking the question.
Uh-huh.
And a lot of people had this sort of app-like view, like you've got this capable thing and you either stick consciousness on or you don't.
Yes.
And I doubt that that's right. I think that a lot of what we mean by consciousness will come along with being a animal that can act in a capable and coherent way, that can sense in a way that takes into account the consequences of its own actions. You know, as you move, you change what you sense. So there's a kind of point of view property that's established by being able to act in a coherent way. I think part of it is that, but I think nervous systems are special also. I think that there are features of nervous systems, the controllers that evolution gave us, and these controllers evolved before there was anything like the kind of motion that nervous systems are used to control now. I mean, the first animals, nervous systems came along really quickly, apparently, and not in an animal that could move around and had arms and legs or anything like that. Something that looked quite plant-like, probably, as far as its superficial appearance goes. But nervous systems, they have a combination of physical properties that I think make it natural that it would feel like something to be an animal that's doing all that movement and action and sensing and doing it by means of a nervous system. I think asking why you would want to add consciousness on top is probably a bit misled, because it's sort of, you're going to have it there. It's going to be there once you're an animal with a nervous system who's reasonably effective and has decent senses and things like that.
And that's interesting. And you talk in the book about the sort of gradual development of sentience and subjectivity and things like that. Rather, because I think in my mind, I always wondered when I was young about, it's like a switch getting flipped, and all of a sudden everybody was like, one day somebody, I mean, I was thinking of men, of human beings in this instance, of what was that moment when all of a sudden a human being. It is a 2001 thing. It is sort of. Well, yes, it is sort of the monolith. But I was sort of like, I always fantasized that must be the moment, because otherwise I didn't quite understand the idea of only being partially sentient.
Right.
That's a little bit strange to me. The idea of being, I'm halfway there to being sentient. And what is that? But then I think, is that a baby? Is that a baby when a baby's in this pre-verbal state? Are they on the way to sentience in the same way?
Interesting.
The question about baby, I think about babies is a good question, right? If we think it's evolutionarily really hard to have a lights on moment, does that mean we think that lights on moments in general are impossible, and that with babies it has to be a lights on moment with no gradations as well? I think we have to get used to gradations, to a truly gradualist view of the origins of consciousness, where there'll be lots of gray area cases.
Yeah.
It's not just, it's not just you who finds it hard to think about. There was a big conference, I think in 2017 at NYU, big animal consciousness conference, lots of people there. And this came up a couple of times. I mentioned it in my talk, and two other people, I think, mentioned it in their talks. And in the room, this room full of eminent people, a lot of people were inclined to say it's just impossible to have something other than a lights on. There has to be a lights on moment. There can't be there can't be a situation where something is sort of conscious, sort of not. So, I mean, Thomas Nagel has that language, is there something it's like to be you? And someone at this conference said, look, there's either something it's like to be you or there's nothing it's like to be you. And that's a sharp distinction. Something
Yes.
versus nothing is a really good example of a sharp
Yes,
distinction.
yes.
But there's a lot of
Yes.
there are a lot of these like what I would call like fuzzy boundary cases where where the like you mentioned babies, for example, Paul, but I'm also
Yeah.
thinking about like hypnagogic states in between like sleep and dreaming. What about when you're on acid and you feel like the self is
Yeah.
disintegrated and you're just
Yeah.
a field of I mean, there's all these
Yeah.
like weird outliers that don't seem to me to admit the idea that you're proffering, which is sort of like slow transitions, qualitative differences between types of consciousness,
Well, one view that the people in the room who were resisting the gradualist view were okay with is the idea that it's like a hop onto an escalator.
Oh,
You go from no to yes, and once you're yes, there can be lots of
Okay.
gradations within yes. So
Uh-huh.
a person might say, with babies, with drugs, with waking from sleep, there's all sorts of interesting differences of degree that are sort of close to the yes-no boundary,
Uh-huh.
but the yes-no boundary is still
It's a
a
jump.
sharp boundary.
And
And I think that's it might be that way. It's not impossible. We don't really
Yeah.
know. But the idea that there has to be a sharp yes-no boundary, I think is just being dictated by what seems natural to us, what we find
Yeah.
easy or
It's
hard.
Cartesian
imagine.
leftover. It's leftover
Yeah.
Descartes.
Exactly. Yeah, I think it is. It is sort of like that.
What's
Yeah.
Descartes? Just explain that though, Steve. What do you mean by that?
Well, just Descartes thought,
he's
just
the
as
I think,
Peter was
therefore
saying,
I am. He's
Yeah,
I think,
and
therefore
he-
I am. Yeah.
And he thought it was a switch, like an on-off switch. Only humans really have it on. Everything else in the animal kingdom, he thought, doesn't have it on. And it was the sense of subjectivity. Like, it feels like I have experience from the inside out. And that's just different from every other kind of experience. It's private. It's inaccessible to anyone else. Those are
Mhm.
features of consciousness that he thought sort of happened by fiat, or he didn't have
Just
any kind of
happens.
evolutionary view. He thought that was what God gave us. It was
Right.
the soul.
Yeah.
you know.
Implanted by God.
There's a sense in which the octopus is being used as a sort of launching pad for thinking about, alien minds. Like what would an alien mind be like? And in a way, the octopus sort of gives us this different phylogenetic pathway. But then also it's being used to think about maybe what would an AI mind be like? It seems like, the thing you're focusing on goes in these speculative directions. I wonder what you think about the possibility of conscious AI, sentient AI, that kind of
Yeah.
stuff.
I think it would take different kind of hardware from the computer hardware that is around now and that people are thinking about. Most people writing about this have a picture where the hardware, the computer machine itself doesn't matter that much. The software is what's important. If you write the right software and have a big enough computer, then it doesn't matter that the computer has the very familiar architecture that our computers have, only bigger. That doesn't matter. If the software is the special software, then the system will have a mind. I don't think that. I think for two reasons. Firstly, I think the reasons we were led to believe that, philosophers went through a kind of argumentation process at the end of the last century that seemed to lead there. I now think those were bad arguments. But also I think that nervous systems, the more we learn about nervous systems, the more special that they look. They have this unusual combination of properties. There's the network, cell-to-cell, computer-like stuff that they do. And there are these large-scale oscillatory patterns, the sorts of things that get picked up in an EEG machine. So brain waves, basically. And it's still very controversial how the two are related, but there's a kind of duality of processing going on there. And it's not that I think that, brain waves are the consciousness or anything like that, but I think that the brain as an object is a very physically peculiar thing that has network-based and less network-based properties. And probably consciousness, at least in us, involves that combination. So if you want to make an artificial system that is conscious, you would have to build a physical object that was more brain-like than an ordinary computer is. You would have to start again on the hardware side, which people don't want to do. And in a way, I'm glad they don't want to do it, because
Yeah,
I'm not sure
right.
this would be a great thing to do. But I'm increasingly, no one really knows. I've got to be a bit cautious about this. But
Yeah.
increasingly, I think that there might be a kind of natural barrier in AI systems where the intelligence side of it can just go nuts. It's just amazing what's being done on a week-by-week level,
Yeah,
more and
yeah.
more impressive systems.
And by that, you mean the problem-solving aspect?
Yeah,
of it. That's what you mean by intelligence in this case. Okay.
Yeah, that side can just go nuts.
Okay.
And does that include like chatbot and stuff like that, teaching it how to write
Right.
a Shakespeare poem about Mars or something like that? It can do, okay. All right.
The sky's the limit with that. But the fact that the sky's the limit with that side might not change the fact that, as you make those systems more and more complex, you might not be making them even a tiny bit conscious. It just might be that they're just not the right kind of physical object to get there, no matter how complicated their processing is. So there'd be a barrier within AI between the felt side of the mind and the problem solving or information processing side of the mind. I think that's a completely possible situation. And in that situation, that may well be how things are. And then when your AI system is complaining to you that it's not having its interests taken seriously and insisting that it's conscious, you can say, no, I don't buy it. You're the wrong kind
You're
of
the wrong
system.
thing.
Well, what would it be doing? Would it be like scraping all kinds of science fiction novels for like shit to say to
Probably,
freak you
yeah.
out?
I mean, it certainly
basically?
seems, yeah. I mean, that whole thing that happened recently with that guy in the New York Times talking to the
Oh, yeah.
AI, and that it started sort of, he was kind of pushing it to its limits, and then it started kind of pushing back. It was clearly sort of drawing on very weird things.
Was that the one that was saying, "Are you in love with me?" or something?
Yeah, and it kept
Is that
saying,
that?
I'm in love
Yeah.
with you, I'm in love with you, and all that stuff. It was interesting. It was a strange thing that happened. It's like it reached some limit, and then it just started kind of pushing back in an odd
I think
way.
that's just like zombie intelligence. It's just linking words and sentences together that have a high probability given the topic that it senses, like the word cloud
Oh.
that it's in or something. This is my guess. And then it looks like it's intentional, but it isn't.
Yeah. And again, you're anthropomorphizing. I mean, you're projecting on it a lot, aren't
Yeah.
you? To sort of like,
I think we're suckers, basically. Like if it like
That's part of it, yeah.
yeah,
what is
we
that?
are
You mean
suckers.
suckers? How so?
Like they've done these tests with they go to an old folks home. This is totally, I'm already messing this up. They go to a senior center and they'll bring like a robot that has like a fluffy like carpet wrapped around it, and they'll find that within like an afternoon everyone in the room is like, this is their favorite pet. They're petting it, they're cooing, they're talking to it like it's alive. It's bringing them together. It's like, I think we're suckers in the sense that if
Yeah.
it has a face,
Yeah.
we can fall in love with it. If it
Yeah.
says two words, we think it's intentional. Like, I mean, I think we were evolved to err on the side of like attributing intention, right? Because it would be sort of lucky. It would be helpful if we thought that the shaking in the grass was an agent of some kind rather than just the wind, because maybe it's a tiger or something like this.
Yeah, some of the very first AI systems, which were incredibly crude. There's a famous one called ELIZA, where you would exchange messages using a teletype on a screen, and its repertoire of responses to things you might say was extremely small and narrow. This is from many decades ago, but people were completely taken in by this.
Sure.
I mean,
That's funny.
I think we are
Yeah, I would be too. I'm
primed
just, yeah.
to buy into the apparent agency of lots and lots of systems.
You talk about brain waves and things like that, which makes me think, and I saw something where you briefly mentioned a guy Berger, who was doing ESP work in the past. And I mean, is that still going on, that kind of thing, in brain waves, and the idea that it's sort of like these kind of extrasensory things are happening? Is that happening between octopuses and things like that? I mean, Are people actually doing any kind of work like that?
No, I don't think they're doing
He's like,
any kind of work.
no.
Well, but the no is in part, if it was there, people, if someone said, "Would you like to work on this?" they would say no, and that's because their career would be placed in serious
Would it really?
jeopardy.
But are there still
Yeah,
people
I think
doing
it's I think it's
Hey,
unfortunate.
Peter, you don't know the right people, man. This is all happening.
You think it's
like,
unfortunate? You think it's unfortunate that people aren't looking into it still as much, or
Well, I think there's a tendency to close off avenues a bit more quickly than they ought to be. And there's, I mean, I think I accept that classic ESP phenomena have been debunked, by skillful investigators successfully. And I don't think octopuses have ESP. But the idea that there could be weird stuff going on that arises from the electrical peculiarities of a brain that might look a little, be scientifically explicable, but still pretty surprising. I think there's a certain amount of resistance to following paths like that because of, you don't want to be the person at the conference who everyone's looking at,
I'd be that guy.
I'd
be that guy. I'd happily be that guy. I'll come be that guy.
That's because you have an acting career, which is probably means you can pay the mortgage.
That's right. That's right. And people, frankly, expect me to do stuff like that. But that's
like, he's an actor.
But he's just an actor. But that reminds me of things that you talk about in the book. That's interesting. Things like this guy, Brother John, who is this monk who loses the ability of language, but he's still somehow able to function without language. And so seemingly kind of blind in a sense, kind of consciously blind, but he can still get through and communicate things to people. That's weird. And that's right. I mean, that's sort of, what is that? That's still functioning without the kind of higher brain functions that seem necessary to sort of communicate with people. He's still able to function that way.
I think it was just language that was, I mean, language can be subtracted fairly neatly from our minds, it seems, because it's fairly, it depends on some fairly specific left brain stuff.
Wait, so this guy has aphasia or something? Just so the
It's
listeners
sort of
will know
intermittent
what
aphasia.
Okay.
He was a monk who sort of suffered these bouts of aphasia. And by blind, I meant he sort of was language blind. He just wasn't able
That's
to.
right.
I mean, literally,
most of his brain's probably fine. I'm reading a book and listening to it by a guy called Ian McGilchrist at the moment, who works on left-right. He's a doctor who's written a couple of books now on left brain, right brain stuff. And he doesn't talk about Brother John, but he does suggest that the kind of surprise that you were expressing, Paul, about the idea that you could function well once language has gone from your mind, McGilchrist would say, this is the kind of thing our left brain wants to convince us. It wants to tell us that
language is in everything.
It's the smart part. The rest is just kind of pretty dopey. And if you took out the language-driven part of thought, you'd be left in the lurch. And McGilchrist does not think this. He thinks that, I think he paints probably an over-stark picture, and I'm going to make it even a little bit more overdrawn in getting it across quickly. But he regards the left part of our brains as this kind of smart ass who thinks it knows everything, has no respect for the rest of our mental lives, and does control a lot of what we do. And that part of us would lead us to expect that if you took out the linguistic ability, the sort of speech ability, particularly speech and inner speech, you'd just be left completely hopeless. And Brother John and some other cases show, no, if you take that out, the rest can do well.
Interesting.
That makes sense to me because I was lucky enough to work with Jaak Panksepp, who's sort of the father of emotional neuroscience. And he didn't think of it as like the hemispheres, but he thought of it as this depth model where sort of the old brain was, now I know this is contentious, but sort of like, imagine you've got the reptile brain wrapped around, and then wrapped around that is a mammalian brain, and wrapped around that is sort of the cortex where the higher level thinking happens, especially in the frontal areas. And And he did these experiments where he just kept like removing parts of the rat's brain to see like when is its behavior compromised. And it turned out you could get way down to the lower subcortical areas before its its social behavior fell apart, its foraging fell apart, but it was like way down. And so his one, this is not the only thing he did to conclude this, but he was saying that we're good at solving problems and even thinking in a kind of unconscious way. And then this sort of linguistic thinking comes late in the evolutionary story. And it's sort of sitting on top of all of these other competencies or capacities that we have.
Yeah, it's on top and it's left-right structured as well, because
okay.
the left is more kind of language infused. In the third book in the series that I'm just finishing now, I have quite a lot about Mike Gazzaniga's work in this area. And he also has the idea that there's this left side interpreter, which is telling stories based sometimes on real knowledge and sometimes totally made up. And the right side has just a different style. It's not dissimilar from the McGilchrist picture I was describing. So there's left-right structure, and there's the Panksepp type upper and lower structure as well.
Do they all have this two-sided brain? All primates and most mammals and things, do they all have this kind of two-hemisphere brain?
Well, not hemisphere. Well, most. So, we have a bilaterally symmetrical style with some stuff duplicated and some stuff not. So, one nose, two ears, one heart, lungs is duplicated. So there's a lot of stuff that's duplicated. And in animals of various kinds, you have different amounts of duplication and non-duplication. So in octopus, you have to have duplication of the optic lobes behind the eyes, and you've got a single thing called the vertical lobe, which is usually regarded as the kind of most high-level processing part of the octopus brain. And it's just one of those, it's not paired. But in lots of animals, you have pairing. So in insects, you have the mushroom bodies, and unless I'm misremembering, those are paired. They're the smart part of or one of the smart parts of like a cockroach has big mushroom bodies, and they look a little bit like...
Really? So a cockroach actually has a fairly big brain, you're saying, or fairly like...
Relative to its body?
By insect standards, well, they got big mushroom bodies.
By insect standards. Yeah, but that's fascinating. Do they have a nervous system, cockroaches, though? Do they have a...
Oh, sure. Yeah.
So they can feel pain, and they can feel, in a theory, a cockroach can feel pain. And
well, the insects for which pain has been looked at closely are bees and, to some extent, flies. And there's a paper, the first author is, her name is Gibbons, working in Lars Chitka's bee lab, bumblebees. And in their paper, the evidence for something pain-like in bumblebees looks pretty decent. So and it's possible to then say, okay, other insects are probably in the club. Now they'll be going too far to say once you show it for bees that insects are sentient. But it suggests, look, I think some insects at least probably are on the yes side. Even setting aside this kind of gray area question, the bee stuff is pretty amazing. And cockroaches, my understanding is there's not nearly as much work done on them. There's lots of fly work. There's lots of bee work.
Nobody cares about cockroaches.
No one cares about cockroaches. But they should.
They should. They're pretty amazing. I mean, they're formidable. They're really formidable. It's crazy. How is a bird? How is a crow? So their brains are not very big. How are they as smart as they seem to be? Sorry,
they seem increasingly smart the more the science
in general,
is done.
And crows, ravens, in that family, they seem particularly incredibly smart. Even the mimicry thing, I know ravens can do, and there's the birds that can mimic, but crows seem crazy smart. But their brains aren't very big, right? I mean, and so brain size doesn't mean anything, I guess, does it? Or
I think we've sort of learnt that just over the last recent couple of decades or so, that size is much less of a predictor than it seemed to be. I mean, bees have, I think, a honeybee brain is about a cubic millimeter. It's really quite small, but they can do very fancy kinds of learning. They can learn from watching each other do
Yeah, that
things.
dance thing they do, they waggle a
The
dance.
dance,
It's
all
fucking
sorts of
crazy.
stuff. 1 cubic millimeter. And I mean, it
Amazing.
would have been natural to have said before all this, look, if a bee can do what it can do with a 1 cubic millimeter brain, we shouldn't expect that a crow brain would hold it back. It's a lot bigger.
Right. Yeah.
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 And to some extent, it's a matter of relative size, but not entirely. I mean,
Right,
if you've
yeah.
got a brain that's too small just to have much machinery in it, then having a small body doesn't make you better off. So some
Right.
stuff is relative size, some is absolute size. Birds have a pretty, decent sized brain relative to their bodies in many cases, but still physically small.
Yeah.
And we've just learnt that size is, not such a big thing.
That's
I take it.
fascinating. But they're not as complex as an octopus. I mean, which seems to have so much more motor complexity than a bird does. I mean, so that's interesting too. Or am I wrong? Is it?
It's relative too, isn't it?
Is that? I can suppose it is.
Different
But yeah.
kinds of complexity, yeah. I mean, there are New Caledonian crows, are crows that are very good tool users, and they make tools. They sort of sculpt a prodding object with a hook on it. They make it out of stiff leaves. Octopus wouldn't have any reason to do that, which is quite important. Yeah, if you say to an octopus, "You can't make tools," octopus will say, "Why should I bother? I've got look what I got."
Yeah, crazy tools. Amazing.
Well, I was thinking too, like related to this issue and the cockroaches before too. There's a story that this guy tells. He was doing research on beetles, and he was working with this beetle. As he was putting it back in the cage, he accidentally dropped the little wire mesh on it. It hit the ground. Its guts kind of exploded out of it. And he was like, oh shit, I was working with this. It was a great beetle. And then he started to realize that the beetle was essentially like scooping its own guts into its mouth and was sort of eating its own, viscera. And when I heard this story, I thought, this suggests to me that the creature could be feeling pain, maybe, but it wouldn't have maybe some sense of self. It might just have a rule, like when you smell fat or protein, eat it. And it doesn't know that it's also eating itself in this case. So I was just wondering, what do you make of this? Is it possible that some creatures can be very sophisticated, but just lack that last dimension? Like, okay, I'm somebody.
Right. I am this thing.
Right.
Right.
The self.
I don't know the particular case, but that's the kind of thing that had a lot of people saying for years that insects just have a kind of blank spot for pain in their, even if insects can experience some things, perhaps perceptually, it was thought that they just don't care what happens to their bodies, basically. And consequently, we could think that insects are perhaps minimally conscious in some ways, but lack any capacity for pain. There's an old paper by a guy called Eiserman who collected a lot of stories like that and made that case. Now, the insect people I know, who are mostly fly people and bee people, they always said, I don't trust that. I don't trust that, because if you want to work out whether insects feel pain, you should look at heat. Heat, they have more interest in heat as something they don't like.
Interesting.
Their bodies, they regard it, it's a bit like, might be a bit like your car. If the wheel falls off, you're a bit annoyed, but it doesn't hurt. It's just the wheel fell off your car. It's just machinery. It's possible that some parts of the insect body, from the animal's point of view, are like that. And it might be that, look, that's my wheel that fell off. It's not just a wheel fell off, but it's my wheel, and I wish it hadn't, but nonetheless, it doesn't hurt. However, the people I know who work on insect pain always thought that heat would be the place, that's where you should look, that's where it'll show up. And that paper I mentioned from Gibbons working on the bumblebee case, they used heat as the aversive experience. So it might be that insects can feel pain, they really don't like heat. They don't care if parts of their bodies fall off in some cases. Now, that incredibly unappealing story about the beetle, I'm not quite sure how to process. I'm not quite sure how to process that.
Well, you have been extremely generous with
Amazing.
your time.
Super
Yeah,
generous.
Really, it's been great.
Thank you. There's so much to talk to you about that.
Yeah.
It's just, and it's wonderful, amazing stuff. And your books are wonderful. So
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for doing this. Really appreciate it.
Real pleasure.
Thanks,
Glad
man.
to meet you guys.
Yeah, nice to meet
Okay.
you.
Chinwag is a production of Treefort Media and Touchy Feely Films. Hosted and executive produced by Paul Giamatti and Stephen Asma. Executive producers for Treefort are Kelly Garner and Lisa Ammerman. Dan Carey is executive producer for Touchy Feely. Our series producer is Rachel Whitley Bernstein. Original theme music by Luke Top, with additional music by Via Mardot. Oscar Guido is our executive in charge of production. Tom Monahan is head of audio for Treefort. Audio production supervision by Matt Dyson. Editing and mixing by Jeff Neal. Animation created by Alex Sokol. Research assistance by Aidan Brooks. Lastly, for more information, go to chinwagpod.fm and find us on Instagram or TikTok at chinwagpod or on Twitter at chinwag_pod.